All right, here we go. Welcome to this session. My name is Wim Decorte, and I'm glad to see I'm not the only Blue Jays fan in the room today. All right, I'm the director of the Clarus practice at Consulting.Inc. I've been in FileMaker for close to 30 years right now. So I started my career in the past century. That's how old I am. This is one of my favorite quotes because it's so true. And I use this one on the community all the time, right? So you may be tired of me hearing that. And this applies to security clearly as well, right? It's when we make a mistake, and we are all going to make mistakes. Actually, in fact, when I get to a different slide, I'll talk about some of our own experience in that. But we will always make mistakes, and it's always our assumptions that will get in our way. So let's keep that in mind. So a couple of questions for you, right? When is the last time that you looked at the access log? Right? Have anyone looked at it this week? No, this month maybe? Yes. There's a couple of good reasons why you would want to look at the access log, and we'll cover that too, right? All right, something else. Take a moment to review this privilege set, right? It looks to be a very permissive privilege set. So I'll start with an easy question. Assuming that the user is not running any scripts, right? The user is just in the interface doing their thing. Can they create a record?
Yes.
Yes.
The answer is no. Can they export it?
Yes.
Yes.
No. Can they run a script?
I'm gonna say no.
They can run a script. I don't need to belabor the point, right? So clearly we have some work to do this afternoon. GYBE, the last part of that string there at the bottom in the extended privilege, is the code for the base elements plugin, right? If I set this extended privilege, what does that mean, right? Does this allow for, say, another file using the plugin to call a script in this file?
On a script.
All right, the answer is yes. All right. Okay. Assuming that I have this file, this layout, so it's a layout called RSOP01, table by the same name, got a field on there. And if I give you this privilege, it's a little small, but we don't need to linger on it too much. But with this privilege set, can the user see the layout that I have on the right?
Yes.
That's right.
No.
It is yes.
See the layout.
Can the user see the value of the some text field?
No. It's beyond.
Yeah, the answer is no. They cannot. Can a script that the user runs, and the script doesn't run as full access, right? It's a regular script. If that user runs a script, can that script access the value of what's in that field?
No.
Yes.
Depends on how it's.
No.
The answer is yes, they can. Right? I will get to why that is in a second there as well. Right? If the user just goes to that layout, this is what they'll get. They can still run a script that will get the value of what's in that field, but visually, when they go to that layout, they won't see it. All right. I'm not going to spend too much time on the theoretical side of the things. I'll spend most of my time on what the platform gives us, the tools that are built into FileMaker, anything that's available to us. But I do want us to get familiar with the lingo a little bit, right? Because this helps if you have conversations with IT departments or with your colleagues and they're skilled in that kind of thing. So the first one is, and this may be obvious, but why is security that important, right? And it's really about this, right? Our clients have assets and we're trying to protect them. Protect them in different ways. They're protecting their integrity, access to them, that they don't get stolen, poisoned, changed, any of that stuff, right? So and that they're resilient as well when we get there. Because there's threats out there, right? And we don't need to pretend that they're not. There's threats out there that can compromise those assets. And when that happens, that causes a loss event, right? And the loss event can be a couple of different ways, right? So it could be the system goes down and now the user or the client incurs downtime. That's expensive to them. Or they may lose their data, or they may get a fine from some regulatory body, right? Or it could just be reactions from others. And I mentioned that we all make mistakes. And recently we transitioned the project from ourselves to another developer group. And they called out that we left some security that was way too permissive. And that's true, right? So our reputation took a ding that day. So that's important to us, right? We need to make sure that we protect the assets of our clients, but also our own reputation when we do these things. So there's a lot of different aspects for us to consider there. All right. So security, or the security domain, breaks down in a couple of different topics or fields, if you will. The first one is InfoSec. InfoSec is really anything that has to do with the dissemination of data and information. And there's an emerging field to that that they call AISec. All right. So with all the AI focus that we had today, we got to think about that, right? Is it smart to send your data to one of those large language models, especially if you have no control over it, if you're not self-hosting that one, right? Clearly not. That's a concern. So we need to think about that. Different ways of doing the same thing, right? So InfoSec, it's really all aspects of spreading information, right? Whether you want to classify that data, not classify it, or prevent that data from being sent anywhere. And then there's OPSEC. That really talks about defending all of the systems, the hardware, the computers, all of that good stuff, right? So preventing that from any kind of attack, physical tampering, all of those good things. That also applies to any kind of vulnerability in existing firmware or hardware, things like that. NetSec is largely the same, but we're shifting to anything where the data gets transmitted over. We're talking about the network, the switches, the routers, all of those things, right? So that's typically NetSec. Or the traffic itself, right? The data in transit needs to be protected, and there's different ways to do that, including some ways that FileMaker gives us. And then there's AppSec. And us developers, this is really our domain. This is where we need to be concerned about, right? So this is what is ours. That's really everything in software design and programming that we can do to prevent bad actors from getting into the solution, getting to the data where they don't need to see it. Right? So that's our area of concern. And very often, the area of concern that we have to deal with when we develop something, then deploy it to our clients, maintain solutions at our clients, it's going to be a bit of a shared responsibility. And we need to be aware of where those boundaries are in that shared responsibility, right? Clearly, we have our own responsibility. Claris has their responsibility. They need to deliver features to us that are not buggy in the sense that they can compromise security. And they make mistakes, right? We make mistakes, they make mistakes. We gotta be honest about that. Clearly, as developers, we gotta make sure that our code that we write does not contribute to any vulnerability. And then we have everybody who's involved in deploying the solution that we create for our clients. And that could be internal IT at your clients. It could be Claris, right? If we use FileMaker Cloud as the way to deploy the solution. It could be third-party hosting. We do a lot of third-party hosting. So that means that we have a shared responsibility in making sure that what we deploy on and the way that we deliver that to the clients is as secure as we can make it. If you were in my training day class on Tuesday on server, I shared some of that stuff. I have two blog posts. One is at least 10 years old. One is a lot more recent, where I share some of that stuff. And a lot of this goes back to my origin story, why I came to realize that this is so important. So I'll send the links to all these blog posts that I mentioned in my presentation as things that you can download then after the session. But I have some thoughts. I have some opinions on that. Let's put it that way. When it comes to security, there's really two guiding principles or guidelines, right? Things need to be secure by design. And what we mean by that is that any software product, because we're talking about software, needs to be built in a way that reasonably protects against any kind of attack, right? So that really nobody can successfully get access to the resources, to the assets, to the data where they really shouldn't. And then they're secure by default. That means that if we deliver a software product, or Claris delivers their software product to us, it should be secure by default, meaning that all of its own settings and configurations should be set to such a level that they don't allow anything that shouldn't be allowed, right? That's what they mean by secure by default. Secure by design is what we have control over. Secure by default is really more of the tools that we get to use to create the solutions. All right, so this was all the theory that I'm going to give you. After this one, it's all about what's in FileMaker, FileMaker Pro, FileMaker Server, these kinds of things, right? So we talked about secure by design, secure by default, and a new FileMaker file is not, right? It just isn't. And we as developers, we're not doing so well either, typically. When we see a lot of solutions, we see a lot of things in the community where people just try to work around the security scheme because they have a pet peeve about it, something about it they don't like, and they basically decide to abandon it wholesale. So we'll get into that a little bit. So why is a new FileMaker file not secure by default? Well, there's a couple of different reasons. So these are the main ones, right? So the fact that a new FileMaker file automatically logs in with full access, that is simply not secure, right? I understand why, because clearly Claris has to make sure that creating or building a new file is easy, right? That process isn't grading from the get-go. So that's why it's there. We need to change that. And most of us do, right? That's a no-brainer. We don't leave that file in there, but sometimes we do. And we shouldn't. The minimum version of FileMaker, for instance, is a file option setting, and it's set way too low. It's set to FileMaker version 12. We've had many bugs over the FileMaker 12 to where we are now 20, and some of these bugs affect security. So that really means that if we don't change this, if we as developers don't change that, that means that anybody with an older version of FileMaker, if some of these bugs are known, I can pick whatever FileMaker version of FileMaker Pro, say 13, 14, where I know there's a known bug, and then use that to open an existing solution right now, right? Even though you as a developer are developing in FileMaker 20 or 20.3 is the latest, right? So that's one of the settings that we need to set. And Versat security systems is one of the main reasons or mechanisms by which we as FileMaker developers are contributing to the problem, right? Making solutions less secure and not more secure. We invariably, when we have these discussions on the community where somebody says, I devised this security scheme that's way better than what FileMaker does, it almost never is. Right? And I use almost, I put that in quotes, right? It really never is. And it cannot be, right? Once you get past the security schema, FileMaker is going to do everything it can to share data with you, right? So if you use that as your security model, you're always going to be running into problems, and it's always going to be something that you forget, right? So either something you didn't know or something that you thought you know. So that's where that quote from Mark Twain comes in. There's a couple of other things that contribute to the problem of why we as developers are not making things more secure. One of them is granting full access to scripts, right? Because sometimes we're troubleshooting and we have the best intentions of creating a privilege set that is as granular and as secure as it can be, and then something doesn't work and you get frustrated and you just throw full access at the script and go, let's see, it works. Well, it does work, but you also leave some holes open there, right? And there's a neat feature, we'll get to it, called custom extended privileges. I almost never see it in use. And I'll be the first one to raise my hand, right? I don't use it as many times as I really could, but it's really there and we should use it. So these are all the elements that we need to consider about your solutions, right? The solutions that you write, we got to think in these buckets and do something like that. I'm not going to talk a lot about the infrastructure level, right? I'm not going to talk a lot about the deployment of I will talk about FileMaker Server, but not about hardening the server hardware, the software, the OS, the network, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about it, right? Like we have to spend sufficient effort there, but that's a different topic, and we simply do not have enough time to cover all of that. It's also an area where us FileMaker developers do not have a lot of expertise with, and that's fine. You don't need to be a master of all things. You just need to be aware that this is something that we need to think about, and then go find the right resources to help you think through that and come up with the best possible solution. Right. At the FileMaker Pro level, we have a couple of different things that we need to consider. Under the advanced options, and I'm sure we as developers, that's the first thing we turn on, right? Clients probably do not need to have this turned on. This gives them access to the data viewer, gives them access to the script debugger. And I realize full well that as developers, when we need to go troubleshoot and we can go to a client and run the debugger there, that's fine, right? But we shouldn't leave these on, right? Some of the bugs, security bugs that we've had in FileMaker since 12 that we have there have come from that area of script debuggers and data viewers, right? So it's a real risk to leave those on so that the client can poke around and because security breaches are very often just people being curious, right, and poking around. So can I do this? Can I do that? So we shouldn't give them more tools than what they really need to do that. This one falls more in the OPSEC and NetSec category. There's really not a lot we can do feature-wise for that or have to do. But FileMaker Server and FileMaker Pro have a feature now called HTTPS tunneling. What it really means is that instead of having to punch a hole in your firewall for 5003, which is the normal FileMaker traffic, you don't have to do that. You can channel everything through 443, which is the HTTPS thing. So keep that in mind, because this is something that really helps with those conversations with IT departments where they say, we don't want to create an exception rule in our firewall or our routers just for FileMaker, right? It takes away one of those friction points, so just be aware of that one. Sure. The ability to install plugins. If you don't use plugins in your solution, then you shouldn't leave this one toggled on, right? Or you shouldn't toggle it on. Because if I can use plugins usually have a lot more power than some of the native FileMaker features, right? Like, for instance, SQL. I can use SQL through a plugin to insert, delete a record, change a record, these kinds of things, which you cannot do with the native FileMaker SQL, right? So if plugins are not necessary, make sure that plugins simply cannot be installed using that FileMaker Pro. Permitted hosts speaks to DNS and SSL certificates, that kind of thing. Sometimes when you want to connect to a server and that server is not protected with an SSL certificate, FileMaker will drop a warning. And you can choose to accept and no longer see any kind of warning for that particular host. Right? So this may be something that you want to have a look at once in a while. Because clearly, if that user now connects to a server that is inherently insecure, there will not be a warning. And you would want to see that warning, or you want to make sure that the client does not connect to that. Right, so it really overrides what I have there. It overrides a lot of these SSL warnings, and we don't want that. Along the same lines as the plugins, there's that thing where you can use an FMP URL, which is really a URL, starts with FMP://, and you can have it run a script, for instance, right, or open a file. If you have no intention of using that feature, then make sure that at the FileMaker Pro level, that it's simply not possible, right? It's one step even before you worry about the security and the privileges that you grant to the users that log in, that you can catch at the FileMaker Pro level. Right? And you may wonder, yes, that's at the FileMaker Pro level. That gets installed at the client. I have no control over that, right? I cannot walk around to all my clients and make sure that these settings are on. There's a feature in FileMaker Pro that is mostly used for server, but that's available for FileMaker Pro as well. It's the assisted install, right? It's a small text file that has a lot of these options that you can toggle on by default. And then when when you install FileMaker Pro, all of these will automatically be set, right? So you can generate it in such a manner that for your deployments, it's as secure as possible, right? So you do have control over that, or at least you can work with the people that do the installation process and work with them in that way. Right, on to anything that you do at the file options level. Right? We're still not talking about privileges and that kind of thing. These are settings that you have available in your FileMaker file. We have control over that, right? As developers, we have control over that. First one I mentioned, you really shouldn't be setting that to version 12. What versions should you set it to? It really depends, right? We often use that to control features. If we know that we're using features from FileMaker 20, we should set it to 20, right? So that nobody will by mistake open that file, and that goes to error handling more than security. But we see that very often where there is no error trapping for that kind of thing, right? So if somebody were to open our solution with an older version of FileMaker, we may be messing with the data integrity, right? Maybe the workflow that we scripted doesn't finish or doesn't finish properly, and bad things happen to the data. Anyway, auto login. Turn it off, please. All right. A credential manager is not a bad thing necessarily. That's more of a conversation thing, right? Should you allow users to store the credentials if you're using internal FileMaker accounts? That is, because this does not apply to externally managed accounts. We'll get into that later. But it should be conversational. Like, should we allow this? Should we not allow this? Right? This goes into the operating system key chain. So it really depends on your level of trust of the operating system and how they manage that. Clearly, keychains, it's an obvious attack object, right? Like, people will try to get in there. So you got to decide whether you want to store your credentials in there or not. Showing FileMaker login fields, we'll get into that a little bit. Somebody's having fun. All right, at the app level, we got two big buckets, right? The authentication and the authorization. We'll get into both of those. And then we have encryption at rest. great feature. There's really not a lot to it. You either enable it or you disable it, but you should really enable it, and I'll explain why you should. File access protection, we'll get into that for sure. And then testing, right? We all test our solutions as all users with all privilege sets. Yeah, we don't, right? We should. Authentication. So that's the first of those buckets. Authentication is all about who you are, right? And used to be we would be able to defend our assets old school by guarding the border, the perimeter, right? So because everybody would be in the same network, right? So we didn't need to protect too much the things that were inside the network if we had good protection at the perimeter of our network. So that moat around the castle used to be things like firewalls, border routers, that intrusion detection systems, that kind of thing. These days, we're in a much different place, right? Since COVID, that has accelerated a lot. But our users are not always in the same place anymore, right? They work from home, they work from different places. What it really has meant from a security point of view is that the identity is now that new moat, right? That's the thing, that's a new frontier. We have to be able to protect the identity. Authentication is all about who you are. Who is that identity? Can we identify the user who's trying to log in into our system? One login has a great infographic on that thing that sort of explains the history of authentication along the lines, right, from your basic username, password, to where we have multi-factor authentication, two-factor or multi-factor authentication, to where we are largely now where we have contextual and behavioral authentication, right? It's a fascinating area if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but that's sort of where we are right now, right? And so it's all these things, including credentials, including multiple factors, but also intangibles, right? Your phone knows how you walk. Your phone knows how you breathe, right? At some point, they'll ask your phone, is that Wim with you, right? Well, they'll ask your name. Obviously, they're not asking if it's me, but that's where we're going with that. Now FileMaker is really excellent at giving us choices for identities. And in opinion, to me, it makes very little sense to make your FileMaker file an identity store, right? I'm not a big fan of using internal FileMaker accounts. I'm just not, for any number of reasons. We've had external authentication for a long while, the three things at the top right there, then we had some OAuth options at the left. But really, since we were given the custom OAuth option, and even before, because together with Stephen Blackwell, we authored many white papers that explain how you can use any identity provider out there as long as it's OIDC, OpenID Connect, or OAuth 2 compatible, which most of them are these days. And this is not an exhaustive list that I have out there. These are just some of them that we have already used with our clients, right? What it really means is that you can pick your identity provider. If your client doesn't have one, it's a great conversation to have with them to say, we should have a good identity provider, so let's pick one. Most clients already have one, right? They may be in the Google space, they may be on the Microsoft side. So they typically already have an identity provider, even if they don't fully realize that they can use it as an identity provider for things like logging into FileMaker, but it's there. All right. So clearly, I'm talking about accounts and then the need to manage those accounts. When you get to managing accounts, I mean adding users, disabling users, removing users, all of that good stuff. My preference is to pick an identity provider, so external authentication that does groups-based authentication. That completely removes that account management from the FileMaker side, right? Whoever governs the identity provider does the account management. It doesn't need to be the FileMaker developer. It doesn't need to be whoever is the administrator at your client that administers the rest of your FileMaker solution, right? That can just be whoever is in control of the identity problem. So you can completely remove the problem away from what you do and how you build solutions. If you're going to use internal FileMaker accounts, FileMaker has some tools that will help you with that, right? You can create a privilege set that gives somebody at your client the right to do account management. They will not be able to create privilege sets or anything like that, right? We're talking about just adding users, disabling users, assigning a privilege set that exists to a user, all of that good stuff. So you can do that by selecting some options in a privilege set that you assign to one of those users. If that user then logs in and goes to manage security, this is sort of what they get, right? So they see the list of accounts. There's some accounts, as you can see, that are disabled, so they cannot mess with a full access account. that's taken away from them. And when they click on the advanced settings, we have more options as developers. They just get to assign and create extended privileges if they want. We'll get into extended privileges in a little bit. Right. One thing that is very often overlooked when it comes to authentication is the authentication order. So FileMaker has that, it's called priority, that's the first column. You can actually drag these things around, right? You can reassign accounts into different orders. It doesn't really apply that much to individual accounts, but if you have groups, a user can belong to multiple groups at the same time. It's the first group that FileMaker will hit in this list, in this priority order. Whatever group is in that first order for a particular user, that's the privilege set that user will get, right? So be aware that there is an authentication order in case somebody belongs to multiple accounts. By default, FileMaker does single form authentication, right? Not good. It's open to things like brute force attack, directory attacks, right? It's a single form. All somebody has to do is be patient enough to guessing usernames is not a big deal, right? I can guess anybody's username because typically organizations have some sort of structure for a username. We do at Soliant. So all I have to do is spend some time running through. You can download 1 billion passwords and test them all, and at some point you'll get in, right? So that's what's so bad about single form authentication. So it's one of the reasons why I don't particularly like internal FileMaker accounts. All right, raises the question. And I'm sure you all know, where are passwords stored in FileMaker? Anybody? Well, they're not. FileMaker doesn't store passwords. It just doesn't. It stores the hash of a password. And then, of course, you have these commercial cracker tools, right? Where they say, if you don't know the account of a FileMaker file, you can go and download it. Those tools cannot reveal your password because your password is not in the file, right? So what these tools do is they sort of guess at where those hashes are stored and then lobotomize your file by stripping those blocks out, right? It's dangerous. It can damage your file because it's not an exact science, and they can be stripping out blocks that are parts of your schema, part of your data, that kind of thing, right? So that's how these tools work. Your best protection against that is encryption at rest. There's no cracker tool out there in the world that can get past encryption at rest, right? So this is one of the main reasons why you should have encryption at rest on all your files. It protects against those cracker tools. All right. We have to talk a little bit about what it looks like to log into a FileMaker file. Right? We're all intimately familiar with the login dialog. There's actually 3 variants of that, as you well know. There's the one that if you use external authentication through OAuth, and this is the default, right? It then hides the FileMaker fields. And it's one of the final options to always show FileMaker fields, and then you get this third option where it shows the FileMaker fields and the OAuth button. So you get to choose which one you want to use. The way that this looks is one of the main reasons that people choose to not use FileMaker security, right? Where they say, doesn't have my logo on it. It's not my colors, right? So they say, I'll just use auto login with some account to go to a FileMaker layout, because now my FileMaker layout, I can script it or I can style it exactly like I want. It has all my branding. Just don't do that, right? I know it's ugly. Live with it. I mean, just the way that this looks is not a good enough reason to compromise security at the level to which you will compromise security by trying to come up with your own nicer dialogue. Obviously, we're talking to Claris about this to say, can you please not make this something customizable, right? So that we can solve that problem. But like I said, it's not pretty, but it's not reason enough to compromise security. So don't do it. It's kind of interesting because on the WebDirect side, you do have full control over it, right? And this is from one of my blog posts. If you have your website on the top left there, you can actually create a button on there that will take the user straight to your identity provider and from there straight into your WebDirect solution. And on the way back, they go back to whatever page you want, right? They never have to see the WebDirect landing page or the WebDirect login page. And this also works if you don't use external authentication. If you use internal FileMaker accounts, there's a way to do exactly the same thing. So there, you have full control over the web UI. Over the login UI, I mean, right? And this is all part of, this is not a hack, right? This is actually functionality provided by Claris to make it exactly so. All right. Oh, no, I went too fast there. We have to talk a little bit about offboarding. because that's an area that is very often overlooked. If a user no longer needs access to the solution for whatever reason, right? They change roles, they leave the company, they go on maternity leave, any reason really, you should be disabling the account, right? And very often it doesn't happen. So keep that in mind. And this is one of the things where you may be using the access log to good effect, right? Periodically go into your access log, see who accesses the file, because then by extension, you will see who does not access your file. So you can then go and say, we have an active account for you, maybe we should take it away, or maybe you should automatically take it away. Some companies have guidelines and policies around these things, right? So using the access log will help you conform to those policies and be compliant with them. Right, I didn't mention that at the beginning, but I'll take questions after the session, and there's actually a room set aside on the other side, Engelman something, that we can go to if you have a bunch of questions, we can get there. All right. We had authentication. The second bucket is authorization, and that really is the privilege set in FileMaker, right? That's all the things that you're allowed to do in FileMaker. And here's the good news. I mentioned that the FileMaker file isn't secure by default, but the privilege sets are. For the most part, I mean, for the 99% part, so that's good, right? So it is secure by default because it gives you the least amount of privileges by default. When you create a new privilege set, it's great. You basically, as a developer, have to explicitly enable the things that you want your users to be able to do. Secure by design, yes, except for the default privilege sets, right? My advice would be don't use them because this is the default read-only privilege set. But see what it can do, it can export. That's not reading only, right? The user shouldn't be able to extract data just because you give them a read-only access. They are able to run any and all scripts in your solution. That's too much power, right? If somebody just needs read access, they shouldn't be able to run a script that does anything, especially if you then gave full access to that script and it's a script that creates a new record. That goes against what you set out to do, right? So don't use the default privilege sets. Just create your own because they all start with 0 privileges, and then you get to decide what you want to do with them. All right. All privilege sets come in different parts, right? So the top left part there really has to do with anything that is data and schema, right? Can they create records, edit records, delete records? Can they create run scripts, create scripts? All of that good things. That is secure by default, as you can see, right? The default is you're not allowed to do it. I kind of like that. When you go to change them, right? So these are the options side by side of these 4 things: records, layout, value list, and scripts. And the top level choices are really easy because they speak for themselves, right? It's really the real power is in the level of customization that you have when you want to assign granular rights and you pick the custom privileges, and that's where a lot of the power is. All right, then you get that dialog, and then for every table that you have, you get to decide if you want to. It's like a binary, just yes, no, but you can also have a calculation there. I will get into that a little bit. To see how you can restrict access to records by using your own logic. That's really what it comes down to. Over on the right-hand side, it was right over here, is this dialogue, right? And this is one of those dialogues that is very confusing because we're talking about access to data, and it has this thing there where it's really talking about fields and whether I can view fields, right? And that's where that question came from in the beginning. Let's see if I have one here. When it says view there, right, on the second column that we have, it doesn't really mean view, right? It means read, right? The other one that we had when we talk about things on the layouts, that's viewing. This is reading, right? And that's where that question came from. Can the user view something on the layout, but can a script that the user runs still get access to it, right? So access to the data, whether you can read the data, that's what that view column is all about. So that's really, you shouldn't be seeing this as just viewing data as it's on the layout and I can see it. And this is where the developer experience comes in and really gets in the way, right? So when you want to get to the level of setting granular writes by using your own logic, basically by having a calculation. This is how deep you are in custom dialogues. And this is just not fun, right? This is not right. Because when I'm there, I'm going like, what was I doing here again? Right? I'm that age, so. But also, I'm going like, this is my calculation. I wonder if that's the same calculation I had in that other table, right? I have to back out 4 dialogues, come back 4 dialogues to check that calculation, go back out 4 dialogues to come back 5 dialogues and say, yes, it is. Right. So this is really one of those reasons where people say, I can't be bothered with it, so I'll just won't do it. All right. Record level access. This is what it really means, right? So you create a calculation. And if the result of that calculation is true, the user will have access to that record. If not, they will not have access. And I mean, one of these actions, right? Reading, deleting, creating, that kind of thing, right? So that's what that logic is. Now, of course, when we look at reading data and you have massive numbers of records that you show, say in a list view, FileMaker has to evaluate that calculation for every single record, whether it's going to show it to you or not going to show it to you. So you have to be a little careful what you put in there, right? Because you can totally kill the performance of your solution by doing that. So clearly there's a tax that comes with record level access calculations. If I have a solution like this one, I have 100,000 records in that table with many hundreds of thousands of related records. And I show that one record, right? It has something like 100,000 related records. If I don't use record level access, that layout gets rendered in 137 microseconds. If I use that same calculation that I have, it's a very simple calculation, right? It's a simple check if I'm the user that created that record. Then it takes 227,000 records. So that's a difference of some 89,000 microseconds. That's the tax. Again, it's a simple calculation. So the more complex your calculation, the bigger the tax is going to be. What is it that we're talking about here, really? Because that looks like a big number, and it isn't, right? That's like a hundredth of a second, thereabouts. I'm happy to live with that, right? But clearly, you have to, one, make sure that the calculation isn't super complex, and two, that you really don't do anything that will force FileMaker to evaluate that calculation many times over, right? Don't show list views with 10,000 records. Nobody can look at 10,000 records at the same time. Why are you showing 10,000 records, right? And it's that kind of user experience and user UI that you can help make and maintain the performance of your solution as you set out for there. Right. So that's really records. The next ones are layout scripts and value lists, and they all have this toggle here where you can set whether the user can create those things. It's off by default, so it is secure by default, but it's one that is somewhat easy to overlook. All right, so the first one there is layouts, and again, this one has their, because this is that funny cross-section, because we just talked about giving access to records, yes or no, but now we're in giving access to layouts, and still they have that thing there where it says, oh, by the way, do you want access to your records? I find that highly confusing, right? It's one of those things where I'm going like, I don't know what to do here, so I'll test very carefully and do that. But I really don't like the fact that it's there and what it does. But keep in mind, the thing, when it comes to layouts, we're talking about viewing, right? So that's really what we're controlling here. So the user may have rights on the record for reading, editing, deleting, creating, that kind of thing. This does not overrule that, right? This is really just, can they see whatever is in the records, right? Whether they can take action on it is governed by the other section. The next big section is this top left corner, extended privileges. Again, default, secure by default, because it doesn't allow you to do anything. I like that, so you have to toggle these things on, whatever you want. This is where we can get into custom extended privileges, right? I have one there named custom 01. This is really where you can put your business logic. Things like create invoice, approve invoice, right? Things like that, or create purchase order. This is where you can create that business logic and stick it into the privilege set, right? Which is the most secure place of FileMaker, right? So instead of creating a user table where you add checkboxes for these things, you can do that here in the custom extended privileges. And this gives you sort of like a level of functional zero trust, because inside your scripting, before you take an action or before you let the user take an action, you can check whether they have rights to do that. And that's the essence of zero trust, right? Where You don't rely on just authenticating people, or you don't give them a bunch of privileges up front. For every action that you do, you check whether they're allowed to do it. So custom extended privileges allow you to do that by just naming them. So, right, I'm using the get account extended privileges. I'm sure you use that function all the time, but it's there, right? So you can check whether the user has certain privileges by doing it that way. This one is a great one. FM migration. It's one that doesn't exist by default, but you can add it manually because these extended privileges are just strings, right? You can just add them yourself. With this, you can create an account that has no rights whatsoever in your solution except run the data migration tool, right? So if you want to automate your go lives, your deployments going from development into production, this is great, right? You can create an account that, because the data migration tool is a command line tool and you have to specify an account. So it's somewhat more easily to discover the account that you're using for data migration usage, but you can make that one that has no rights except do that, right? So if somebody discovers the account that I'm using for that and tries to use it to get into my solution, they can't. I haven't given them any other privileges but this one. So one to keep in mind. This one was added in 19.2.1. All right, what does it do? Probably not going to go into a whole lot because we're running slightly out of time. I have a blog post that describes this. It really governs, it closes one of the biggest security holes that we've had in a long while. The ability to be in one file, use a plugin in that file, and make it run a script in this file without a file reference between the two files, right? So this wouldn't invoke file access protection because I'm not making a reference to that other file, but I can attack this file from this file by using a plugin. This one, this FM plugin extended privilege takes that away, right? If you add that to your extended privileges, no plugin can call a script in your file from the outside. Right? It plugs an enormous hole. And that blog post explains how you can use and that kind of stuff, right? And then there's a bunch of other privileges like printing and exporting. Again, it's secure by default. It doesn't allow you to do anything at all. So all is good there. Now, the last one is this available menu options. That trick question I asked, whether the user could create a record and that kind of thing, and everybody said yes, and the answers were always no. It's because of that, right? If you set it to minimum, you basically take away all of the actions that the user can do in the user interface. Even though they have rights to do it, they simply cannot do it because it's not there. There's no command in to create a new record, right? So anything that they do, there's no right-click menu. So all of that goes away by setting this to minimum. So this one, it doesn't overwrite their rights, right? If they have an ability to run a script, that's why I used, like, assuming that they're not running a script. By running a script, their normal rights are going to be evaluated and invoked, but just from the menu, just from the UI, this overrides pretty much everything. All right, so that was the privilege set that I used for that one, right? So although it's permissive everywhere else, this one is what made it not happen for the user. And then there's these special authorizations that you can allow, grant full access to a script or donate a script for CD shortcuts. Got to be extremely careful with that. It has some consequences that you probably did not anticipate, right? For instance, if I take my file, I run it to the developer tool, and I neuter the file, I take away the full access account, right? The admin account, I strip it out. That's what that first setting then does in the developer tools. So you think I'm safe, right? Nothing can be done with my file. If I have a script in that file that uses open managed database, and you run that with full access, it's going to run, it's going to open, right? So even though that there is no full access in the file anymore, just by granting full access to a script, it'll still do it. So be extremely careful with these things, right? If I can guess at your script names, I can do nasty things in your solution. You don't want me to. So be careful with that. Encryption, we only have a minute left, so we gotta go through this. Encryption at rest, I think it's obvious, right? We should enable it. I gave you a really good reason why you should do that. It's in the development tools. You should do that on all your files. You can actually, since recently, there's a command line version of the developer tools, right? Which is actually a little easier to do, and it allows encryption there as well. So you can encrypt your files to the command line. Again, makes it easy if you go from development to production. Use the data migration tool because it's command line. You can use the developer tools, it's command line. So you can completely automate that stream of taking something from development into production and making sure that it's as safe as possible. Similarly to encrypting something that is at rest, and at rest, of course, it means if the file is closed and you get a copy of the file, it's encrypted. That applies to your backups, right? All of your backups are secure or more secure if you use encryption at rest. And transit is something that we have to do as well, right? And we're talking about custom SSL service, is what we're saying here. This does not apply to peer-to-peer sharing. Peer-to-peer sharing is deprecated anyway. You should not be using it at this point. So it really means that you have to use Cloud FileMaker Server. That's the only way that you can get encryption in transit. But that's the best way to go as well. This comes straight from the FileMaker help. If you were in my training class, you've seen this. You have to use a custom SSL certificate, right? You have to. Don't use FileMaker defaults one. File access protection. It's on by default these days, which is great. If you have an old file, it's probably off by default. And I highly suggest you leave this room, go fix that. And I'm not kidding. This is the single easiest way to get into any file, right? If that thing is off, I can get in your file. I can guarantee it, right? All of the ersatz security systems that we had on the community where people go like, I built this thing, it's the coolest thing ever, it's so secure. Any of us have done this. Stephen have done it, I have done it, Josh Ormond have done it. It takes us about 2 minutes, right? We're in your file and we give you your data to say, yeah, maybe not so secure, right? So if you have older solutions, go check that, right? Turn that on. New files that you can create, it's already there. And so it used to be off. And it does have an effect on plugins. In that blog post, I'm not going to go to that flowchart, but in my blog post that talks about that extended FM plugin, extended privilege set, it tells you what it does, how it branches, whether file access protection is on or off, and whether it allows a plugin to make a call between files. So keep that in mind. All right, and testing, like I said, we do this rigorously. But you can really only test what you know. What it really means is that you should document how you want security to look like as you gather specs, right? When in your conversations with clients, I use something like this, an Excel sheet. I call it my security matrix, right? So that you really just have it with you as you're discussing groups of users, roles, when you discuss areas of functionality, and you can just flesh this out as you go along. And then this will give you something that you can then use and say, how do I translate that into what those privilege sets look like in FileMaker? It's also great for testing after the fact, right? Where you can go like, should I'll put this in my use case and say the user should not have access to this. So I can go and test that and see if that is true. All right. Lastly, at the FileMaker server level, we have a bunch of settings and some of them are hidden. HTTPS tunneling, this is where you have to turn it on. I mentioned where you can toggle on at the client. Obviously, they have to go in pairs, right? If your server is enabled, then your client has to be enabled. You cannot have it enabled in one place and not in the other place. File list filtering is on by default these days. I have a screenshot for that. I'm not sure if I do. I don't. File list filtering means that if you use FileMaker Pro and you go to your host, your server, you click on your server, you will get challenged for credentials first. And these are obviously credentials for the files that you have, but based on those credentials, FileMaker Pro will only show you the files that these credentials are active in, right? You will no longer see a list of all the files on the server. It sort of cuts down on the curious people saying, what's this file? Let's see if I can get into that, right? So it's on by default. If you don't like it, you can turn it on. Turn it off, but it is more secure by default by leaving it there. FileMaker has 2 default folders where you can put files on server. One of them is called the secure folder. That's really there so that your on-premise FileMaker server can mimic FileMaker Cloud. FileMaker Cloud, by definition or by default, will enforce stricter security rules than the on-premise version of FileMaker server. For instance, FileMaker Cloud will not allow files that are not encrypted at rest. They have to be encrypted at rest. Otherwise, they don't go on FileMaker Cloud, right? So if you want to if you want to get the same behavior, just put your FileMaker files in the secure folder and the same rules will apply. So it will tell you, I'm not hosting this file because it's not secure. Or it say, I'm not going to host this file because you're using auto login with a default, with full access password, which is also not allowed, right? These things, or a guest account, for instance, should be disabled. So these things you can enforce security on yourself by putting your files in the secure folder and get some benefits that way. That's where you can find that. And there's also this setting, this, by the way, are some of the hidden settings in FileMaker Server. You can get to them by using FMS admin get server prefs. Don't go fiddling with those, right? Call me first. Require SecureDB is true by default, right? So that's the setting where FileMaker Server will enforce some rules, like the one that I said. Like it will not allow you to do auto login on a file. Or for instance, let's put it this way: it will not host a file where you left like its default state with the admin with full access and no password, right? It'll say, I'm not hosting that file. That's what requires SecureDB does for you, right? So don't turn that off. It makes no sense. And of course, external authentication, we talked about this. I'm a big fan of external authentication. So you can just go and turn that on there. SSL certificates, yes, you'll see this one again. An SSL certificate does two things, all right? The first thing is it validates the name. We always think, well, an SSL certificate does encryption in transit, and yes, it does. But don't forget about the name validation. It validates that the server you're calling by name to connect to is actually the server as its name. That's what the name validation does, right? So there's protection in that because now you can be assured that the server you're trying to connect to is actually the server that you want. Because you have to use a custom SSL certificate, if you, this is sort of like the, let's put this on the screen there first. I don't have outside access to my files. I don't need a custom SSL certificate, right? That's that argument. It holds no water, right? It's any security audits, any security review, any breach review that you can download from the last 10 years will tell you most of the security breaches originate from inside the network, not from outside the network, right? So even if you have no outside access, just do the right thing and get an SSL certificate. Second bullet there, that does require DNS, right? Because now you're calling a server by name. There's got to be something that resolves that name into an IP address to make the connection, right? So don't use outside DNS for that. Use inside DNS for that for your internal users. And you'll be good. Access log, we mentioned it, right? So do spend some time looking at that thing. It's on by default in that list of hidden sections, settings. You can set the size and you can set the, actually you cannot set the rotation. FileMaker Server only keeps two copies, the current one and the old one. So if it exceeds the size that is set by default, which is 40 megs, if I'm not mistaken, then it'll create the old one and start a new one. Now, if that one exceeds 40 megs, it'll delete the old one. So you may want to archive these things, right? So periodically, weekly, monthly, depending on how many access events you have, maybe you want to write that off, right? So that you can give yourself some information for when you need it. If you think that you got a breach 3 months ago, you may not be able to find it in your access log if you don't archive your access logs, right? So spend some time thinking about that. The event log will log some events around authentication, like failed authentication will show up in the event log. So there too, you can set the size, but you may also want to archive these things and write them off. Right, so keep track of that. The event logs, both the access and the event log, are really good candidates for any kind of monitoring. Like any monitoring tool in the world out there, and we talked about Zabbix in the past, they can all process logs, right? So if you have Zabbix, New Relic, Datadog, doesn't really matter. You can point them at the FileMaker event logs, get them parsed, create rules for that to say, if I have an event that I don't like, send me a notification, put it on a Slack channel, anything like that, right? So monitoring is great for these kinds of things. And of course, this is where using an external identity provider is even better, right? Because they have these things built in. These are the features that you inherit automatically by using an external identity provider. You don't need to do anything for that. They give it to you, right? You get compliance reports, you get some AI on that to analyze your logs. It's a great feature, and this is actually from Azure AD, but they all have it. I mentioned this briefly. If you neuter a file, like I said, you can use the data migration extended privilege to do that, right? And then on the server these days, oops, that's too fast. Anyway, I won't go back. But you have the data migration tool is built into the server these days, just like the developer tool by default comes with your FileMaker server. So these are great tools to automate those go lives, right? So you can automate it and keep it secure at the same time. The admin console is something that you want to think about and restricting access to that. Since a couple of versions ago, the admin console now uses port 443. Fortunately, there's a bunch of other features in the FileMaker server side of things that also uses that port, like the data API, WebDirect. With that in mind, in the admin console, you can restrict access by specifying IPs or different IPs that could have access to the admin console. Right? So that's one way that you can keep that port open, but still be certain that people won't be poking around trying to get into your admin console that way. There's another way of doing that, and the people who were in my class on Tuesday have seen this one before. This is actually a feature of FileMaker Server, right? This looks kind of weird, but you can put a load balancer or a reverse proxy in front of your firewall so that you can then basically set rules there to say, I want people to get access to my admin console and my APIs, or just my APIs and not my admin console. That's done with, as I call it, reverse proxying. If you've never looked at reverse proxying, you can just learn by looking at how FileMaker Server does it. Right? FileMaker Server has a bunch of reverse proxying in itself. Top right is Nginx. That's the FileMaker Server configuration for the admin console and the admin API. IIS and on the bottom left there. So it's a great way to learn from how Claris deploys FileMaker Server. We can do the same thing, right? We can put a reverse proxy in front of our network to say, we are now fully in control over who gets access to what parts of our FileMaker Server deployments. Along the same lines, we have things like WebDirect, right? This is a very common deployment option that people are trying, and we talked about this a little bit, right? So you have a WebDirect worker, you want to give outside access to your solution through WebDirect, but you want to keep your main FileMaker server secure. So that one is behind a firewall, but you want to put your worker, you sort of feel like you have to put your worker in the DMZ so that it's publicly accessible. So this is what most people try to do. That's not the right way to do it, right? This is the right way to do it. And this is a feature that FileMaker Server offers, right? FileMaker Server has a load balancing reverse proxy feature. Anyway, we have a blog post that explains how to do it, but this is highly secure because now nothing that relates to your FileMaker Server deployments is outside in the world. Outside in the world is a simple Nginx reverse proxy server. It's a tiny server, it just runs Linux. You can harden it to your heart's content. It just runs Nginx as a web server to basically reverse proxy to the things inside your network. Your WebDirect workers, your FileMaker Server main machine, they're all safe and secure behind your firewall. All right. I'm going to leave it at that. We got a couple more minutes left for questions, and then I can take questions there. What I really wanted to convey to you is I wanted to show you some aspects of security that you probably haven't seen yet or have forgotten as you went along, right? Also showed you some of the complexity or the confusion that may come for if you start working in the privilege set. But really, I wanted to convey the message that we should spend more time thinking about the security as early on in our development cycles as we can, right? That little Excel matrix that I showed that I call my security matrix, so just keep it handy, right? Fill it in as you go along. It's a great way to challenge the client when you're gathering specs, right? To say, do these users really need that? Or now we discussed two groups of users, but they look very similar from a privilege point of view. Are we really talking about two different groups of users here? So there's a lot of ways that you can use that to drive business analysis and specs gathering as well. And will give you something that blueprints for then implementing that security and testing that security as you go along. So thanks for hanging in there. We got 2 minutes left, so I'll take some questions if you have them, and then I'll be outside and answer more questions. So I'll go there.
You talked about the tax we pay for record level access.
Yeah.
And I felt like there's a higher tax that we're paying when when doing search on a table. Once you have them in the list view, I think it's as you described it, but it felt to me like if you have a large table and you run a query and say, okay, well, I need those records, before you get your records back, it can take a fair bit of time.
That will depend solution by solution. The question was that regular level access task, that 100 of a second for basically displaying our records. It'll depend a lot on the number of records that you have, whether you go to do a search, but there's actually a very cool trick there. If you start your search by doing just an asterisk search, FileMaker is very fast and it'll automatically limit to the records that you have access to, then do a constraint on that one. So yes, you have to do 2 searches instead of 1, but you speed things up significantly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yep.
And we take advantage of authenticator apps when logging in.
That's a great question. With FileMaker accounts, native FileMaker accounts, you cannot, right? FileMaker's native accounts are single form, basically username, password kind of authentication. But any decent identity provider that you pick, yes, absolutely. They have authenticator apps, right? So Microsoft has their authenticator. You can use things like LastPass or anything like that. Absolutely. Pretty much all of them do. And Stephen Blackwell and I have, for one of the last DevCons, I forget which one it is, we actually did a video to do complete passwordless login into FileMaker, right? 2020. We were using YubiKeys, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, all of these things, because now you offload that to the identity provider who have already solved for that problem, right? So basically you just inherit the feature and away you go. Absolutely. Yeah.
I've forgotten, can you disable users' access to the preferences so that they can't turn on advanced tools and the like?
So the question is, can you take away access to the preferences? You can and you cannot. The simple way to do that is a custom menu, right? Where you give them a menu where they don't have access, but now you have to make sure that there is no way that they can get out of your custom menu, right? So you can-ish. It's not part of the security schema, but you can, yes. Steve?
Server-side script schedules or third-party APIs, do you use local accounts or ID?
Great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yep. For any kind of API access or server-side schedules, that kind of thing, do I use externally authenticated accounts or internally authenticated accounts? You can use both, right? So there's nothing in the FileMaker feature set that prevents you from using externally authenticated accounts for these kinds of things. Sometimes it can be kind of tough to implement that, right? So if you want to do full security, I would say go the distance and implement that. We sometimes do internal accounts for those things, right? Because they're easier to do and they become what we call service accounts. IT departments, they grasp the notion of a service account. They typically don't have an issue with that. The beauty then, of course, is you have to spend extra time on the privilege set attached to that internal FileMaker account, right? So give it only the things that you need to do through that API and nothing more, right? And the basic one is take away the FMAP, right? So that if anybody can see those credentials somewhere and they try to use that to log in using Pro or Go, they can't, right? Because you haven't enabled that. That's all like your basic protection. Good question. Yep.
Is it still considered best practice to use internal accounts for full access users?
Another great question. Is it still considered best practice to use internal FileMaker accounts for full access? It depends on the identity provider that you pick and whether you thought through all the consequences, right? For instance, if you use regular AD, Active Directory, and you use a full access AD secured thing, it's actually very easy to spoof Active Directory, right? So it's a lot tougher to do, for instance, if you use Azure AD, right? So I would feel more secure by using an externally authenticated full access account if it's Azure AD or one of these OAuth providers than if it was OD or Active Directory or Open Directory. If I had to say if you make it a yes or no answer, I would say best practice is still use an internal account for that. Don't use an external account. But many bigger companies won't allow you to, right? Even for the full access accounts, they want to put that under some sort of control where they will put your AD account in a particular group for a particular amount of time to give you access to a system so that they can take it away in an automated fashion. like I said, AD is kind of hard to spoof, but then you get the benefits from the other, for that mechanism that they implement, right? So sometimes it's a compromise and a trade-off. So it's really about that conversation about like, what trade-off am I making with this, right? And to be aware of that.
Is there a performance penalty for using encryption at rest?
Is there a performance penalty for using encryption at rest? Normally there is. I've never seen one, but there's got to be one. With FileMaker, now here's the thing. FileMaker only has to decrypt the file when it starts hosting it, right? So it's not like an ongoing decryption as you're asking for records. As soon as FileMaker server has the file open, it's decrypted, right? So there's no ongoing penalty for using the file. It's largely in opening the file and then encrypting the file where it has to decrypt and encrypt as it goes. All right, if you can think of more questions, look me up, but thanks for being here.